elkaar uit China. Ja, weet ik wel. Ja. Ik heb sommige mensen uit China. Ja, dat weet ik. Ja, ik heb het ook gehoord. Ja.
Die heel uit China oriënteert.
Nee, dat wist ik niet.
Heel uit China. Dat is de ereburger van Winston Johnson. Dat is heel uit China oriënteerd.
Misschien ook bij.
Ja, maar natuurlijk is het niet gunstig. Als je dat cultuur kent, dat hij niks met China wil. Leuk maar het is ook wel
ja, dat is natuurlijk wel een hele rugzak voor. Dat moet je allemaal zelf uitzien. Ja, die komt ook in de fiets. Ja, dat weet ik niet. Nee, kijk, daar heb ik mezelf niet bij laten betrekken. Er wordt net als iets gevraagd. Ik heb wel tegen ze gezegd, maak er nou een volwaardige bestuur. Want hij moet vooral wat mogelijk. Ja, dat is een lang. Wij zijn ook sowieso een stap als Nee, ik denk dat nee, maakt niks uit. Het is ook nog een behoorlijke periode. Voor mensen die zouden denken dat hij doet er niet naartoe, is dat te lang. En dat houden we goed. Ja, bovendien hebben we ook een druk af van de dat is een slechte. En heel ervaren, dus ik weet ook zeker dat het zo is. Daar ben ik dus niet. Ik ga naar voren.
Yeah. So, good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Thank you so very much for attending this Vrienden van Kopenhagen lecture already for the 4th time. And I was just wondering during the coffee, I was just wandering around a little bit and asking some of you, why are you here? What is it you will try to find this afternoon? Are there specific questions or issues you would like to talk about? And then most of you said, well, there are 2 things why we are here. We are very attracted by today's theme about the pros and cons about urbanization because, well, if you just follow the news and the latest newspapers, then there is a wide discussion going on when it comes to urbanization. But at the other hand, everybody of you said and replied immediately, we are here because now we can meet up and catch up with our old friends, which is, of course, a very, very important reason to be here this afternoon. Well, my name is Simon van Trier, and I have the great honor to be your moderator for this afternoon. And one of my tasks is to make sure that there is some room and some time for Q&A. Because this theme, after having heard our keynote speaker and the alderman of the municipality of the city of Tilburg, I think it will be very interesting to also hear your opinion about what has been said here on stage. So, we will start, and I am looking for, of course, Director Magnificus for the Tilburg University for a true word of welcome, as well as a short insight in this afternoon's program. So, Professor Klaas Seidsma, please step on stage. The floor is yours. You can give him a hand of applause. Yes.
Well, thank you very much to start with. Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to have you all here today at the 4th Copenhagen lecture, which focuses on urban society. This event joins alumni, especially Vrienden van Kopenhagen, and colleagues, staff, and students. It gives me special pleasure to see so many alumni return to their alma mater on this occasion. The lecture is an initiative of the alumni network Vrienden van Kopenhagen and Tilburg University Society, together with our Development and Alumni Relations Office. It introduces highly innovative international speakers and contributes to creating a future-proof ecosystem for Tilburg University. In the past years, we welcomed Dani Rodrik, who spoke on the rights and wrongs of economic science, Victor Meyer-Schönberger on digital society, and Anna Appelbaum, I don't know if I have to pronounce this as if she is German or American or English. Anna Appelbaum, I will say, on democracy and disinformation. This year we are proud to welcome Edward Glaser, and I'm pronouncing that name correctly, in our midst to discuss the pros and cons of urbanization. Edward Glaser is Professor of Economics at Harvard University's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, where he has been working since 1992. Glaser gives many lectures on microeconomics, complemented by urban and public economics. He was director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. He has published dozens of articles on economic growth and the law and the economy of cities. His work focused in particular on the determinants of urban growth and the roles of cities as centers of idea transfer. After the lecture by Professor Glaser, we will focus somewhat sharper on urbanization and aim the spotlight on the city of Tilburg. Berend de Vries will provide us with this view. Berend is alderman of the Municipal Council of Tilburg since 2010. He's also an alumnus of the Tilburg Law School of our university. His portfolio contains economy, energy transition, and urban planning. Who else than Berend de Vries can take us on a journey through Tilburg? I would like to elaborate also a little on our alumni. I can't ignore that, of course, and I won't. Today, we have more than 70,000 alumni, which is an impressive number. In addition to now serving, so today serving 18,000 registered students on our campus, last year showed several records in the history of Tilburg University. One was that we received the highest number of donations ever, and that is something we applaud, of course. Another was that the highest number of alumni ever supported our students as mentor or coach or helping as volunteers with events. By sharing your skills, knowledge, networks, and your feedback, you actively help advancing our students and society. Tilburg University is grateful for these efforts and for the financial support received through the University Fund. This fund creates scholarships for students and funds for research and education projects. Having mentioned your wonderful contributions, please don't hesitate to continue joining us by providing your experience, ideas, networks, and funding. More means help us making ourselves even more useful by supporting people who need this the most. Ladies and gentlemen, alumni, thank you very much, all of you. It is heartwarming knowing that you are so strongly committed to your university, our university. Shortly we will start with the lectures. First, I give the floor to alumnus Piet Hein Roorda, chairman of the Vrienden van Kopenhagen. I wish you a wonderful and highly enjoyable afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Klaas, for welcoming us and mentioning the importance of the alumni network for the university. On behalf of the board of the Vrienden van Kopenhagen, it is with pride and pleasure to welcome you all and have you here this afternoon for the fourth Vrienden van Kopenhagen lecture. As you all may know, for 28 years, the Vrienden have been closely connected to each other and to our alma mater. As an alumni network, we connect graduates of all schools and programs of Tilburg University. We organize various events throughout the year to strengthen our network and to connect to students, young alumni, and employees of Tilburg University, as we are today. Some events are specifically for members of our network, or as we call them, Vrienden, and some events we support as Vrienden van Kopenhagen and are organized by Tilburg University itself. On other events we organize together, such as the Coach Cafés and today's lecture. Many of you participated earlier this afternoon in one of the parallel sessions addressing different aspects related to the theme of this afternoon, urban society. And I'm sure you've had an interesting session, at least I did, and good discussions on these topical issues already. The keynote, however, of this afternoon is a topical issue in these turbulent times. For example, many cities in the Netherlands have presented ambitious building plans to fulfill the growing need for housing in the Netherlands. We're very honored that in cooperation with Tilburg University Society, as well as the Development and Alumni Relations Office, we have succeeded to attract the international renowned Professor Edward Glaser this afternoon from Harvard University to give a lecture about urbanization and its pros and cons. Professor Glaser has been looking forward to come to Tilburg, as he told me during lunch, and to again spend time in the great urban environment of the Netherlands. And subsequently, Berend de Vries, Alderman of Economic Affairs, Circular Economy and Spatial Planning, will share his thoughts and discuss the theme from the point of view from Tilburg. Further, I would like to take this opportunity to show the events we have planned for this year. And as you can see in bronze, you will find all the events for the members or potential members. And in blue, all the events we organize together with the university. And specifically, I would like to mention the Coach Café, in which the students can meet members, Vrienden van Kopenhagen, and discuss with them what the the Vrienden encountered in their careers, what their possible pitfalls were in their career, etc. What I also would like to mention is the boardroom meetings we have, and I think we have a very nice and interesting boardroom meeting at the company called Lightyear. One of the alumnus, Lens Melze, is working there. They're manufacturing solar cars at the high-tech campus of Eindhoven. And last but not least, another type of event we organize is meeting Professor Boudewijn Haverkoort, who will tell us more about cyber physical systems. So this really, I think, shows that we have a big variety in our program. And well, I would like to encourage everybody who is not a member yet from the Vrienden van Kopenhagen to enlist, and even our membership fee is tax deductible, so it's really a bargain if you would join our program, giving all the lunches, dinners and drinks we also serve during our events. On behalf of the Vrienden van Kopenhagen, I hope you will have an interesting and wonderful day at our university, and I hope to see you at one of the other events this year. And really feel free to contact me later today or one of my fellow board members to ask about the alumni activities that we yearly organize, and if you would like to join. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pietijn Roorda and Klaas Heidsma. Thank you so much. Tax deductible. Yeah, that's fun. It must be at this University of Economics. And I saw Ed saying like, whoa, this is Dutch to talk about these kind of things. But it's about time that we are going to meet Ed Glazer. Because as I said, in the run-up to this meeting for this afternoon, well, I did follow the media and the news a little bit specifically on this today's theme, like pros and cons of urbanization. And I must say that it's more cons than pros if you do read the newspapers. We have wide discussions when it comes to, for example, nurses and teachers not able anymore to find a living space downtown Amsterdam. They are forced to go out, although they are needed within the borders of the city. Then that tremendous nuisance caused by tourists, by Airbnb tourists, really disrupting the residential way of living in our cities. The enormous lack of, and it was already mentioned, of living areas. We must build 1 million units. Can you imagine what that does mean? All those kinds of things, and then often all these discussions are ended by the general consensus that people say, what has all this to do with the quality of our lives? Because apparently the quality of life is at stake, and that all has to do with these economics of urbanization. And that's why we are so very happy to have Edward Glazer with us here this afternoon, because we kindly invite him to talk and share his latest insights when it comes about the determinants of urban growth. What is it? Is it something which just rolls over us because time goes by and world population growth? Or is it something which is intended or unintended, the result, the consequence of our human behavior, of our policy making? What is it? So there's a lot to discuss, there's a lot to learn, there are a lot of insights, and here he is for us here this afternoon. Please, warm welcome for Edward Glazer. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind. Thank you all so much for spending this time with me. It's been 6 years since I've been in Tilburg. I was here the last time talking about the incredible economic engine that is the Brabant region at the first Copenhagen summit. Today I'm going to be speaking more generally about the upsides and downsides of urbanization. But I do want to call out one very local thing that was highlighted in the introduction, which is I'm a small reason why you're here. The larger reason is to connect with each other. That is urban density at work. And the fact that you value face-to-face contact with each other is a sign of what makes cities great and what makes cities important. Now, I want to start by making the point that cities rest on a three-legged stool, on a tripod. The first leg of which is the magic of human interactions. It's the fundamental pro of cities that on some level outweighs all of the cons. It's the fact that we are at our hearts a puny species when we are alone. Few people in this room could keep up with a decently sized bear if we had no other help. But collectively, we've been able to work miracles in technology, work miracles in governance, work miracles in culture. And I can think of few countries that embody the magic that comes out of urban interactions, the collaborative chains of creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits from Athenian philosophy to Facebook than the Netherlands. This is one of the world's great urban societies, and when we think about things like democracy in its modern form, that is something that is created by the urban spaces and the urban residents of the Netherlands as they rose up against their non-urban overlords in the late 16th century. Those interactions are captured in this slide by the Old Market of Jerusalem, which captures one way in which cities enable people to become better than they would as individuals by buying and selling. But of course, there are many other ways. There's the chance encounter with a friend who teaches you something. There's the warm smile of a neighbor who makes your life a little bit better. But, as the introduction emphasized, there are also downsides of density. Right? If someone is close enough to give you an idea face-to-face, they're also close enough to give you a virus or a bacteria. And if someone's close enough to sell you a newspaper, they're close enough to rob you. Right? Cities have, for thousands of years, been trying to deal with those downsides of density. And that is why cities need rules and an effective public sector. And one way to understand all these cons that are in the news today is that the public sector has not caught up with private sector success. That in fact, dealing with the downsides of density felt like a much less difficult thing in the 1970s and 1980s when the urban world seemed to be over. But today we're in a world in which demand to be in Amsterdam is huge, and so we need public policies that are around that. In my picture here, I have, this is an image of the Boston and Cambridge police departments dealing with the marathon bombing from 5 or 6 years ago. It's one example of the many ways in which cities have to deal with these demons that come with density, what economists call the negative externalities associated with having people around you. The third image, right, is the third leg of the stool, which is the built environment. Economists are always fond of reminding architects that the real city is not the skyline. The real city is not even the beautiful homes along the canals that we all remember from Amsterdam. The real city is humanity. The real city is the flesh and blood that is connected by that density. And structures don't work unless they actually serve the needs of the people. But of course, people do need structures and infrastructure. They do need houses, they do need space, they do need commuting areas. They need to be able to walk to places, they need to be able to drive to places in some cases, right? And cities need to build to accommodate change. And if you think about the fundamental reason for the housing crisis in the Netherlands, it's fundamentally because the amount of new construction has not kept up with the amount of demand for these spaces. And I have no idea where the Netherlands should build. That's not my job to tell you where you should build, how to figure this out. And in many cases, the challenges here are much harder than the US because you have precious urban spaces that must be protected. Right? But not every urban space in the Netherlands can be precious, and you need to find some areas in which to allow the high levels of density that are needed to allow cities to accommodate the people who want to come into them. So it's about this triad, and now I'm going to take you on a tour, first a little bit about why cities have come back, and then diving into the discontents of modern urbanization, then diving into the cons. Now, fundamentally, the ebb and flow of urban growth is about a dance with technology. Cities are formed by the technological events during their era. This is one of the first great centripetal technologies. I'm going to differentiate between centripetal technologies that pull us together and centrifugal technologies that push us apart. Right? This is an aqueduct, probably the single most important pro-urban technology ever, because there is no more important job for urban government than providing clean water. This is the one in Segovia. It's also fairly splendid in its way, but this was a technology that enabled cities to form. Indeed, the 19th century was a great centripetal century Technology starting with horse-drawn omnibuses, moving into steam-powered factories that could be located in urban cores, moving to elevated railroads, and then, of course, the skyscraper, right? This great invention that married a steel-frame structure that enabled you to soar to the sky with the safety elevator that enabled you to travel up and down at reasonable speeds. This was an innovation that enabled cities to sprout up in a way that was unimaginable before 1850. Of course, the 20th century, particularly in America, was a centrifugal century because it was a century in which many of the most powerful technologies caused the death of distance. Right? The car was very much a child of the city. It was a child, first of all, of urban Germany, right? Something Americans tend to forget, that in fact it was Germans who came up with the internal combustion engine, not Americans. But of course, we did make it cheap. Right? Detroit may have been the most productive place on the planet in 1950, and in 1890s it was a place no less entrepreneurial than Silicon Valley in the 1960s. Right? There was a genius on every street corner, not just Henry Ford, but the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, Billy Durant, Ransom E. Olds, right? And collectively they figured out how to make an inexpensive automobile for ordinary Americans. But this invention that came from the city was a deeply problematic child, in that what the car enabled Americans to do was to rebuild their urban spaces around the automobile. And that's exactly what we did throughout the entire 20th century. Right? We left our old urban spaces and we rebuilt our cities around the car, which is something that America still has to deal with. Right? And indeed, the difference between the American urban structure and that in Europe reflects the fact that so much of our cities were built during the 20th century where the car was dominant and where transportation costs were low enough so you could have one large city surrounded by empty space. Whereas the cities of Northern Europe were formed during a time of very high transportation costs, and so of course they have lots of little cities everywhere because transportation costs were very high. So cars and highways also had the effect of killing the older industrial cities. You know, every one of America's largest cities in 1900 was on a major waterway, because those waterways enabled the flow of goods, and indeed then rail cars then backed up this water power. The decline in transportation costs, highways, containerization, right, cheaper trucking, cheaper railroads, enabled industry to leave those urban cores and move to places where labor was cheaper. So first it moved to the suburbs, then it moved to so-called right-to-work states in the South where labor unions were not empowered. The work of Tom Holmes compares areas on different sides of state boundaries and shows how much more industry grew after the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act that enabled right-to-work states. And of course it moved to lower-cost areas across the globe. Right? And by that, this was the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, was not automobile production in Detroit, but it was garment production, the sewing of clothes in New York in the 1950s. This was an industry that lost 500,000 jobs in under 6 years. Right, just hammered by globalization. And indeed, when I was growing up in New York in the 70s, this was very much a feeling that New York was a city whose time had come and gone, and it was a dinosaur looking at the trash heap of history. And of course, this was not something that was unusual in urban Europe as well. This is an image of Liverpool from the 1980s, where particularly older industrial cities felt as if they were completely headed for the trash heap of history. Now, when I started in this business in the late 1980s, there was a fashionable view that said just as containerization and highways had eliminated urban industry, new forms of transmitting knowledge over space would kill off urban finance, would kill off urban consulting, would kill off urban publishing, would kill off all of the idea-intensive industries that still existed in cities. And this was a deeply fashionable view. This was, of course, the high-tech information technology of the 1980s, so just to remind you of what that looked like. But I thought, looking at this didn't seem right to me. That, in fact, this would not happen as the world got more technologically sophisticated. And I've been pleased that I was right. That, in fact, the last 25 years, the trend has not been centrifugal. The trend has been centripetal. And we see things like this is the Wallace office at Bloomberg City Hall. This is the Googleplex in California. We see the rise of urban spaces, both in the US and in Europe, and even more so in the developing world, where massive cities from Karachi to Kinshasa show up in places that are both poor and sadly too often poorly governed. Right? It has been an urban quarter century, and it's been quite remarkable. So why didn't information technology kill off face-to-face interactions and the cities that enable those interactions? Well, I think the dominant effect of globalization and new technologies has been to radically increase the returns to being smart, to radically increase the returns to human capital. Right? We have literally thousands of studies showing that being smarter is now worth a lot more than it used to be. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. This is what cities do that matters. And they always did this, right? They always enabled these chains of creativity. But in 15th century Florence, or in 15th century Bruges for that matter, that produced spectacular art, but it did not create the economic engine. The economic engine would have been around weaving, right? I mean, it was about a much more, not the chains of brilliance, but the core economic function. In the 21st century, those chains of brilliance, right, the chains of new ideas, that's what powers the economy. That's what makes Eindhoven work. It's not about making ordinary goods more cheaply. It's about collaborative brilliance. Another way to think about this is as the world becomes more complicated, we have more complex ideas that are easier to get lost in translation, right? Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your students at all, okay? And we have these wonderful cues as humans for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. All of you surely know that if you're going to have a difficult conversation with someone, you want to do it face to face, not over Twitter. Okay? You want to actually have some ability to see how it's impacting the person and adjust your message. As the whole world gets more complicated, as technology gets more complicated, those face-to-face interactions have become more valuable, not less valuable. And you see this, right, in these two images. So this is the Bloomberg's Wallace office at the City Hall in New York. Which is based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, his company, which was based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor, which Bloomberg ran before he went off and started his own business. Now, trading floors are something of a puzzle. Here we have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in a normal industry would be sitting in a large office protected by a giant oaken desk, enjoying all the privacy that their wealth has made possible. But here they are in a trading floor, they're on top of each other. They're yelling at each other, they're getting food on each other, it's all a mess, right? Why are they there? Well, they're there because in their industry, right, knowledge is incredibly valuable. Knowing a little bit more of what's going on in the markets can make you a fortune overnight, which is why finance tends to be so urban, because the urban edge in transmitting information is so valuable there. They're there fundamentally because knowledge is more important than space. And that's what's happened over the last quarter century, is that cities have come back because economic changes have favored knowledge, they favored innovation. And if you really thought that new technologies were making face-to-face interaction obsolete, then what in the world is Google doing buying the Googleplex, building even larger structures so that everyone's on top of each other, buying 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan? Why are they doing all this? Because they know this is how their creative business works. They want their people as often as they can next to each other. They want no barriers between them. They want the flow of information to be as complete as it can. They want to create the experience of an urban work environment where knowledge flows quickly. So, and this is the background for what we've seen over the last 20 years. So this is a map of the US, and what I've done is I've taken the 3,000 odd counties in the United States, each one on average with about 100,000 people. Each dot takes 1/10 of those counties, so 300 counties. And I've sorted them in the basis of their density levels. So what the blue line shows is the relationship between density and earnings. And of course, I've used density because at their heart, cities are density. They're the absence of physical space between people and firms. They are density, proximity, closeness. And what the blue line shows is that the densest 10th of America's counties have earnings that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists call agglomeration economies, and it reflects a lot of things. It reflects the fact that sometimes people in cities are better educated. It reflects the fact that there may be other forms of selection on attributes into cities. But after 30 years of research on this, I think we're fairly convinced that this is actually a treatment effect. That actually people who move to cities actually do experience real visible wage gains. And they're not wage gains that happen overnight, but rather year by year, month by month, workers who come to cities experience faster wage growth, which is most compatible with the view that cities are forges of human capital, places where people get smart by being around other smart people. The top line, the red line, is slightly more surprising, which is the relationship between density and population growth. So whereas at the start of the 19th century, Americans were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we are clustering in. This is the same graph for the European Union. Okay? So these are the NUTS 3 regions. The blue line shows the relationship between earnings and density. It is stronger in the European Union than it is in the US. So I said 50% higher. In the EU, it's double. It's double at the top than it is at the bottom. So the earnings gap is really huge. The population relationship is weaker because, in fact, population growth is not driven by differences in fertility in Europe or the US. It's driven by migration rates, and Europeans migrate much less than Americans do. I'm not going to mention as much about the developing world. Hopefully something will come up in the Q&A. But many of the most exciting things that are happening in cities are happening in the developing world. It is both saddening when you see some of the downsides of urbanization, but it's important to remember there is no pathway out of poverty into prosperity that does not run through city streets, right? 2007, we crossed this halfway point where the majority of humanity lives in cities, and it's hard not to think that that's on net a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have income levels that are on average 5 times higher, and infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3. And it's striking, right, when we think about the quality of life problems in developing world cities, that in fact, people in urban areas in the developing world are actually happier than rural dwellers. And that's exactly what this graph shows. So what I've taken is, this is from the World Values Survey. It's from about 10 years ago, 14 years ago. The gap here shows the difference between rural and urban happiness in the country. So in wealthy countries, there's no big difference. You should not expect to be happier by moving to one place versus not. Reminding you that I'm an economist, not a lifestyle consultant. So these are all clustered around 0. Some places like Italy and New Zealand, the urbanites are less happy than the rural dwellers. Or rural New Zealand is pretty nice, as is rural Italy. And of course in Sweden, as anyone can imagine what rural Sweden is like during January, the urbanites are much happier than the rural dwellers. But the place where you see really a huge gap is in the poor parts of the world. India, Ghana, Mali, Moldova, Rwanda, these are places where there's a huge happiness gap. Despite the pain of living in an Indian slum, it beats the unending, stultifying poverty of rural India. The only exceptions are Iraq and Thailand. Iraq was in 2005, during 2007, experiencing what economists would call certain exogenous negative shocks to their cities. Other people call that bombing. And of course, Thailand, I attribute this to Bangkok's traffic jams. Now, the success of cities in the 21st century is not uniform. It's not as if every city does well. It's Detroit, Cleveland, these are still places that are troubled. Liverpool is not back, no matter what you hear from the occasional capital of culture year that Liverpool experienced. But some places, it's easy to forget now, but in 1971, 2 jokers put up a billboard, a sign on the highway leaving Seattle, asking the last person to leave the city to turn out the lights. Right? Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. Before Amazon, before Costco, before Starbucks, before Microsoft, right? And this is Milan as well, reinventing itself like Seattle as a former decaying industrial town into a cultural capital of the information age. What is the magic sauce? It's education. Human capital is the bedrock on which national, individual, and local success rests. Right here, I'm showing you the relationship between per capita GDP and share of the population with a college degree across America's metropolitan areas. This is not just the impact of individual human capital, individual years of schooling. Holding your years of schooling constant in the US, your earnings go up by about 10% as the share of adults in your area with a college degree goes up by 10%. This is something economists call human capital externalities. This is the relationship between human capital and area growth across the US. So you can see these areas which have the highest levels of human capital have population growth that are about 4 times, 3.5 times higher than the least educated areas, right? If you want to understand why Detroit looks different than Seattle, you don't have to look further than more than 50% of Seattle's adults have a college degree. About 13% of Detroit's adults have a college degree, right? They're doing exactly as well as their education predicts. And indeed, if you think that what cities are doing are enabling people to learn from one another, education is so crucial because it means you've got more to teach and that you're better at learning. Now, the most important things that go on in learning in cities are not the things that we teach in colleges and universities. Despite the incredible value of universities, I just want to make sure the Director Magnificat knows how much I'm on board on that, and can I remind you that your deduction is tax deductible. But beyond that, it's the stuff that's learned at work, at the table, on city streets. What the great English economist Alfred Marshall was talking about when he wrote 130 years ago, that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. And it's that idea of knowledge in the air that stands behind this. Now, when it comes to these things that are learned on the street, I can think of nothing that is more important and valuable than the knowledge and inclination to become an entrepreneur. 60 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and noting that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh was even then. He argued that this was a reflection of that garment industry, which was an industry with very weak returns to scale and no barriers to entry, in which anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. And so it was a mother of entrepreneurial invention. And the entrepreneurs who got started in the garment industry would go on to found movie studios, would go on to build skyscrapers, would go on to found banks, right? Over and over again, right? You see these garment industry entrepreneurs going on to do other things, and that is a bedrock that the city relied upon. So when the industry faltered, it had talent that could reinvent itself, because entrepreneurial human capital is fungible. If it's good at looking for opportunities in clothes, it's good at looking at opportunities in other markets. Whereas by contrast, Pittsburgh has U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel trains company men. They're very good at solving short-run logistics problems. They're very bad at reinventing themselves. It is amazing, given how weak our measures of entrepreneurial talent are at the local level, how powerful they are at predicting urban resilience. In this case, I'm just using average establishment size. This is employment growth. This is the difference between 160% employment growth and 30% employment growth. These are the places with the smallest average establishments. These are the places with the largest average establishments, right? Huge difference. Also, I could measure this with the share of employment in startups in the initial period. Or I can look at proximity to coal mines or iron mines at the start of the 20th century, which also predicts having larger firms. I can look within industries. I can look within geographic regions. All of them show the same things. Lots of little scrappy firms leads to urban resilience, leads to urban reinvention. A few monolithic large companies leads to stagnation. Now, you can make up for that if you have an educated enough population. So Boeing is large, and Seattle is a bit of a monolith, but it is sufficiently well educated that it does all right. Detroit is also a monolith, but it's a monolith with less educated workers, and so it is still dealing with the hangover from that industrial success. Now, one last point about why cities have come back. They have also risen as places of consumption as well as production. They're places that it is fun to be. They're places that have fixed goods like access to museums or beautiful spaces that we can enjoy. And as the population of the world becomes more educated and more interested in higher-end pleasures, right, they want to take advantage not just of competition in urban labor markets, but competition in urban restaurants or among art dealers as well. And so over the last 30 years, we have the rise of cities as places of consumption. Which creates added pressure on urban housing markets, because you actually want people not just who are there for their jobs, but people who are there to have fun. One example of this is the rise of reverse commuting. The idea that anyone would live in Manhattan or in the Bronx and then commute out to Westchester would have been thought as completely bizarre in the 1970s, right? You had to pay people combat pay to make them put up with Manhattan in the 1970s, right? Today, New York is filled with people who are actually there, and they're there to play, and they go somewhere else to work. And that is what a consumer city looks like. That is some part of what we've seen in terms of the great pro-city price tilt. So this is using Zillow data over the last 20 years, and the high dots there are the places that are right close to the central downtown, and then you can see the price growth declining. So you've seen a real tilt over the last 20 years, whereas the suburbs, which were the great hope of the 50s, 60s, and even early 70s, right, have stagnated. The intra-city, the really close-in areas, have soared in price, creating both winners and losers, right? And when you think about why we think that building is a good idea, it's not just because of the people who live in those houses. It's because it reduces the pressure to gentrify older, cheaper neighborhoods that are close to downtown. Technological change has also made this easier. Zipcar, Airbnb, Uber, well, not in Tilburg. There are a variety of different ways in which we have this sort of rise of a sharing economy. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that sharing economy innovations help cities, because cities have always been examples of a sharing economy. What is an urban restaurant but a shared kitchen, a shared dining room? What is an urban park but a shared backyard? Right? The difference is you can share more things. So why didn't you have Zipcar in New York in the 1970s? Well, you'd go to Times Square to pick up your car, and there'd be like a dead body in the trunk or something, right? And you know, it was New York in the 70s. For those of you who haven't seen Taxi Driver, right, this is what the city was like. And it would be a really unpleasant experience. Now with the technology, that doesn't happen. And so we're able to share more things, and that just feeds to cities' strengths. This is, you know, the idea that you would have trusted a stranger to come to your house and pick you up. This is what we thought licensed taxi drivers were like in New York in the 1970s, let alone an unlicensed person who just randomly showed up. And again, the technology makes us feel comfortable with this. Now, the downside of all this success is that the public sector has not kept up with private sector success in cities. We have all of this demand for urban areas that puts stress on the physical city, on the infrastructure, and on this sort of public side of rule keeping, of regulation. and the public sector has not kept pace with it. And I'm going to talk about 5 different examples of this, one of which is more of an issue in the US than it is here, but it is sort of an important thing everywhere, which is cities seem to be providing productivity, but not opportunity, meaning that kids who grow up in urban areas are not seeing the same level of economic benefit that you would expect them to have. Secondly, we're going to be talking about affordability, of course, and I'll be saying a little bit about Airbnb, the evidence of the US. Third, I'm going to be talking about non-urban areas, the rise of jobless heartlands outside of this. I'll say a little bit about congestion in infrastructure, the traffic difficulties, and rule of law in the city. So here goes. So this comes from this amazing data that my colleague Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren have put together using linked Social Security data, where they're able to link the income of the parent and the income of the child 30 years later. And so this gives you a measure of upward mobility across the US. And with this data, cities look terrible in the US. So this is across city population. I could put population density as well. The larger the city, the lower the upward mobility. This is within cities, right? Basically flat, and then as you get to very high densities, right, opportunity goes strikingly down. The people who are living in these dense areas are doing less well. This is at the border of a central city school district. So we have this very sharp geographic definition of where you can go to school in the US. This shows the mobility jump right at the border. So there's a huge jump up. And if you want something even more scary, this is for African Americans. This is the jump in the probability of being in prison, in jail as an adult, right at the central city school district. So if you're inside the central city school district, your probability is 6%. That falls to 5% if you're outside it, right? So a quite striking regression discontinuity jump right at the city border. This is, in fact, cities have always been places of inequality. And I have always been willing to defend urban equality, right? Another word for inequality is diversity. Cities attract both rich and poor people. They attract rich people with the ability to spend their money in a fun way. They attract poor people with the promise of upward mobility, with finding a better job, with better social services, right? But the caveat to that is that we only can love urban inequality if it's not permanent. Right? If cities are machines for turning poor people into rich people, if they're providing an upward escalator, then this is something to be admired. If what they're producing is permanent pockets of joblessness and poverty, then that is something to be deeply worried about. And I think as the European population becomes more heterogeneous, the risk of that goes up. Right? This was always going to be more common in ethnically heterogeneous US than in ethnically homogeneous Netherlands. But with different populations moving in, this is something you need to worry more about. So I'll give you 3 different hypotheses for this. First of all, cities attract the poor, and this represents unobserved parental human capital that is potentially compounded by neighborhood effects in schools. It's possible. Everything we've had suggests that that's only a moderate amount of it, particularly for the within-city variation. Urban density permits interactions, right? Permits people to buy and sell drugs, right? Permits parents to do things other than taking care of their kids. So, for example, I live in an American suburb, and I promise you there's nothing for me to do other than make my kids do their math. Right? I've got no interesting leisure activities other than that. And third, urban density enables more segregation, and it is segregation that ultimately lowers upward mobility. We've got a little bit of evidence that really shows that. So this is the level of segregation, and this is upward mobility for African Americans. And so you really do see bigger segregation in American cities, and you can imagine why that would be in a small town. It's hard to be too far away from anyone. The larger the city, the more that you have these isolated pockets. And one fascinating tidbit that comes out of the cell phone data is that adults, right, poor adults, even poor adults who live in poor neighborhoods, do not live segregated lives. They go to jobs where they interact with rich people, when they interact with well-educated people, but their children do. Their children either live in the neighborhood or they go to segregated schools. And so it's a very different world for the adults and for the children. So this is challenge number 1. And indeed, it's a challenge that's much more relevant in the US. I would say it's the largest challenge facing cities in the US. It's not the largest challenge facing cities in the Netherlands. Challenge number 2 is around the built environment. There is a Scylla and a Charybdis, right? There are twin dangers around urban land use planning across the world. One of which is NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. The other is monumentalism, building for the sake of building, right? This is Mumbai, which is a city which adopted, this is complete insanity, they adopted the British Town and Country Planning Act in 1968, as if any planning that worked well for Yorkshire or Dorset would be appropriate in urban India. They had a floor area ratio limit of 1.25, which means on average, you can only build to 1 1/4 stories. Part of this was driven by sort of a deep hope that this would prevent urban growth, but of course it didn't prevent urban growth. It just made sure that that growth was as dysfunctional as possible, because instead of building reasonable towers, right, it sprawled out. It sprawled out and created dysfunctional, underperforming informal slums that just ignore the rules. This is Astana. This is, place number one for monumentalism, right? Nobody needs these towers there. And of course, you see in many parts of the world, particularly less democratic parts, places where there's building for the sake of building, and that is also a mistake. I'll give you a little bit on housing markets and how at least I understand them. So this is a picture of the great housing convulsion of the 2000 to 2011 period. Along the horizontal axis is the growth in prices between 2001 and 2006. Along the vertical axis is the decline in prices between 2006 and 2011. I want you to take away 4 facts from this. 1, there's huge heterogeneity in American housing markets, right? Some places had incredible booms and busts, like New York or Phoenix, and some places, like Houston, barely moved at all. Typically, the places that build a lot don't have their prices move. Typically, but not always, the places that don't build are the ones where you get the big convulsions. Second thing I want you to take away from this, the level of mean reversion. This is normal in housing markets. Typically, for every $1 a housing market sees its price rise over 5 years, it goes down, housing prices then go down by 32 cents over the next 5 years, right? So mean reversion is quite normal in housing prices, but this is not 32 cents mean reversion, this is 95-cent mean reversion. This great price wave was a boom and bust that came out leaving nothing but financial wreckage in its wake. Third thing I want you to take away from this, the negative outliers, right? Well, there's Detroit, the one city that managed to miss the boom and still experience the bust, okay? And then there are the cities built on sand, Phoenix and Las Vegas. These were the places that never should have had a boom, because in fact, it is easy to build in Phoenix and Las Vegas. There's no lack of American desert land on which you can build forever, and these places have regulations that make it really easy to build. And so for 40 years, prices in Phoenix and Las Vegas were perfectly aligned with construction costs, which in the US means $80 a square foot or $800 a square meter, right? That's what it costs to build. Then all of a sudden, right, these places became vastly more expensive, and of course it was a bubble that was obviously going to burst, and it did. Last outlier, of course, are the dense areas that retained value, the ones that are above the line, New York, Washington, D.C. And that mirrors a broader pattern, which is over the last 20 years, if you ask yourself, where did price growth go? Here I've ordered things on the density level. All of the price growth in America's metropolitan area has been in the places with the limited amount of land. Another way of seeing this, right, is that it's really about price growth has been driven by conflagration, by the combination of demand and supply. But supply matters much more than we would normally think or we historically would have thought. Okay? There are a bunch of areas here. Along the x-axis is how much permitting there was between 2000 and 2013, so the amount of new building that was allowed by local governments. Along here is the gap between housing price and the physical cost of building, the difference between the value that consumers place on this product versus how much it costs to build it. What you notice from here is the places that are really expensive don't build a lot, and the places that build a lot aren't expensive. Okay, there's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. If you have robust demand for an urban space and you don't allow construction, it will get more expensive. And all of the attempts at public policies to rewrite those rules will fundamentally fail. Demand-side subsidies, cheap mortgage rates for buying lending, some form of modest amount of affordable housing units given to a favored few people who get to lottery into it. None of it is a substitute for having a robust private housing supply that makes sure that anyone who comes to your city can rent a home at a reasonable price, and that only comes by actually enabling enough building. Now, the problem is, where can Amsterdam build? Okay, and this is the challenge. And again, as I said before, it's a difference between the US and the Netherlands, because there are small parts of American cities that are historically magical and need to be protected, but they're not huge. Right? There's a lot of urban Netherlands that's actually kind of magical. That's kind of patrimony of the world. And so I'm leaving this to you. You've got to figure this out. I am not going to opine as to which area of urban space is right for you to build on. But you should just keep in mind a little bit of geometry, which is, right, demographic projections argue for 1 million more housing units in the Netherlands over some longer time horizon. At 100 square meters per unit, that means 100 square kilometers of space. At an FAR of 10, that means you're building to 10 stories on average, you can put that on 10 square kilometers, which is just a circle with a radius of 1.8 meters. So if you're building to an average of 10 stories, that's just a 2-kilometer radius circle. If you're building to 5, you need a circle with a diameter of 5 kilometers, right? So just keep that in mind. The taller building you are, the more you get to keep of this stuff, okay? So you get to keep this stuff if you build up, But the lower you're going to constrain your housing supply, the lower you're going to constrain heights, the more you're going to eat up of this stuff, or the more you're going to provide limitations on construction. I just want to sort of remind you of this, that there's also a profound social justice element to this. Every time you're saying no to new construction, you're saying no to a family that wants to come and experience urban space. You're saying that the families that remain there have to spend more. And there's fundamentally no possible alternative to allowing more construction, to creating cities that are engines of opportunity for a larger number of people. Now, Airbnb. Banning Airbnb is, I'm not even going to call it a Band-Aid. It's like an 18th of a Band-Aid that's put onto dysfunctional housing markets. I'm not saying it's nothing, and this is more generally about sort of various bans on investment properties, but it's pretty darn small. So I have a PhD student who's just graduating this year who is working on lots of protests on Airbnb rentals in the US. And she goes through a fairly complex mathematical model of estimating this. This shows you where Airbnb rentals occur in the US. Occur in New York. This is where they're particularly in these downtown areas or in Brooklyn Heights. She estimates that there is a welfare impact that comes from the reduction of housing supply, but it's pretty small, right? So per year, the median renter loses about $100 per annum from Airbnb. So all of Airbnb is costing the average renter no more than $100 a year. Right? And that's from a city with a fairly large Airbnb basis. And not only that, and you can see this from the graph, it's actually the rich people who suffer. It's actually rich renters who suffer. And the reason for this is that poor people in New York live here and live here. There's no Airbnb presence there. The Airbnb presence is in the sort of core areas which are, areas where nice people live. So it's, modestly attacking where rich people live, which is to say that you may want policies around tourism in Dutch cities. Right? There may be negative externalities associated with having people who are coming in and who are behaving in a disorderly fashion. As I've tried to emphasize throughout, cities need rules, and particularly if there are tourists who are prone to large amounts of drinking on a weeknight, you may want to impose those rules a little bit more strictly. But trying to outlaw this market, which provides plenty of value in its way, it isn't a solution to any kind of housing market. It's just a convenient scapegoat because you don't actually want to tackle the real problem, which is actually delivering large scales of actual affordable housing. Third point, what about the areas that are left behind? Okay, yeah. This is a map of joblessness in America. And when I was born in 1967, 5% of prime-aged males were jobless. Prime-aged in the US is defined as being between 25 and 54 years, a definition which I increasingly find deeply offensive as I head towards the upper boundary of that. In the past 10 years, more than 15% of prime-aged men have been jobless, so there's been a tripling of that rate. This is probably America's largest unsolved social problem, right? It's happened and we have no idea how to do it, and it's most certainly not geographically neutral. It is concentrated in this area, what I've called America's Eastern Heartland, which starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi, rushes up through Appalachia, and then ends up in the Rust Belt cities. This is what the same graph looked like in 1980. Again, some of the same regional disparities occurred, but it was just at such a lower level. And it's different than not working for women. Okay? Not working for women is a north-south divide. And I fundamentally want this discussion to be about men because men who are jobless do different things than women who are not employed. Women who are not employed actually do things like caring for children, caring for sick relatives, doing a variety of social things. Men who are not employed do one thing and one thing only, which is they watch massive amounts of television, right? 4 hours on average, right? And they are miserable. There's also a huge difference in the sense that women who are not formally employed, they may be slightly less happy than women that are formally employed, but it's a tiny difference. Men who are not employed, this shows the gap, right? This is earning more than $50,000, the share who are really unhappy, earning between 35 and 50, earning less than 50. This is jobless, right? Huge gulf. And the important thing here is that not working is related to misery because, in fact, happiness is only vaguely associated with how much money you earn. Right? Whereas not having the social support that comes from that job, not having a sense of purpose in this world, that's actually far more problematic, and that's why this is such a curse. One of the reasons why this joblessness has remained so fixed is that of the long-term employed, 30% of them are living with their parents, and their parents don't seem to be willing to move to a better labor market to do better. America has become more European in its regional landscape. American mobility rates have declined precipitously. So we've gone from having 6% of Americans move counties every year to under 4% of Americans moving counties. When people do move, the skilled move out, and this assuredly is true of rural areas in Europe as well, that you have a brain drain. So having everyone move to Amsterdam is not likely to be a feasible solution. And in other ways, we're getting a greater amount of geographic sclerosis, which is which is also associated with the limits on building in new areas. And you see pictures like this. So this is the not working rate in 1980 for prime-age men. This is the not working rate in 2010. And so we need at least some policies to deal with these permanent pockets of lower density joblessness. I think most important around this is education. But in the US, I've certainly come to a place in which I'm more comfortable with employment subsidies that are targeted towards high jobless areas. Urban density, urban downside number 4. Demons of density, most important of this is contagious disease. This is death rates in New York over the last 200 years. A boy born in New York in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than the national average. That's about the same gap as existed in Shakespeare's time between London and the rest of England. Today, life expectancy is about 3 years longer in New York than outside. This didn't happen cheaply. It required, above all, investment in clean water. America's cities and towns were spending as much on water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. But infrastructure is not enough. Okay? And that's why I want to show you this. That sort of the great piece of infrastructure in New York was the Croton Aqueduct. And as a child, I was raised on this story that said New York was filthy, and then those wonderful engineers came in, and they built the Croton Aqueduct, which took the filthy water out and took the clean water in, and then all of a sudden New York was a paradise. Well, that story is clearly missing a huge part of the action, because this is when the aqueduct was built, and for 25 years, the city was still having cholera epidemics. In fact, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather died in that one, in the 1849 cholera epidemic. And the reason for that was exactly the same problem we face in sub-Saharan Africa today, which is the last mile problem. You built the aqueduct, and the poor people still weren't willing to pay to connect. They were too poor to pay for those connections, and so they continued to use the brackish water from the shallow wells, and they continue to die. It's only in 1866 when the Board of Health requires tenement owners to connect and imposes fines, right? Imposes quality of life-based rules that makes people connect, that the city starts getting healthier. Cities need rules. And in some sense, in the Netherlands, you have had such a wonderful urban society that has imposed things without any heavy-handed government interventions for so long, right, that you've forgotten that sometimes you actually can't just rely on the community to actually impose everything that keeps quality of life down. You actually may need to have harsher rules, particularly when they're not people from inside your society, but people from outside your society. You needed rules. Okay, that's about incentives. I'm just going to say one thing. What does that graph show? I work on clean water in India. It's clean water in Zambia. And one of the things that's really fascinating is even though they build the pipes, they break down constantly. Maintenance is a huge problem. But they don't fix the pipes very quickly. They fix the pipes mostly when people actually pay for the water, when people pay by the liter, rather than when they pay by the month. And so you really need the financial incentives, and that's what that shows. This is very strong correlation with percent metered connections. When people pay for the water, then the water company fixes it. When they don't pay for it, then they don't fix it. In terms of driving, it's about incentives and infrastructure. The fundamental law of highway traffic, as identified by Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner, shows that the number of vehicle miles traveled increases roughly 1-for-1 with the highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. You can't just build more roads if you expect your cities to become livable. You have to do something to limit the use of it. And there's no better alternative to this than pricing. Singapore has had congestion pricing since 1975. It's the second densest country in the world, and its roads move swiftly. And if we introduce autonomous vehicles, which lower the cost of sitting in traffic, we will make traffic worse because people are more willing to sit in traffic unless we introduce road pricing from the beginning that makes them pay for the social costs of their actions. I'm going to skip this. In many cases in infrastructure, there are two technologies in the developing world. Crime. In the New York City of my youth, crime seemed like it was the great problem. This gives you just a homicides per 100,000 people over the past 200 years. And you can see this is when I was born, about here, right? And we just experienced this sense that a city was out of control. You still do not have a major crime problem. I mean, I talked to Sylvester, and he said, Ed, you have to say something about crime. We're having a big crime problem in the Netherlands. There's no data that suggests that you're having a crime problem that looks anything like the real crime problems of either American cities or anything. But I will say just a few things. This is, images from my youth. A few things that we know about crime and fixing crime. Wait. Okay. One of which is that, so just two observations. One of which is that the way that drugs are sold actually matters. And this is a point that came from Brazil, and it came from the impact of the UPP urban pacification program in Rio de Janeiro. It turns out drugs, like most products, you can either sell in the model of the dentist or a tailor, whereas you know your provider, and you call up your dealer, and the dealer brings you drugs, or there's a supermarket. You go to an open-air drug market and you buy stuff. Now, it turns out that one of those models, the supermarket, is vastly more prone to create violence than the other market. And the reason for that is if you take over the supermarket, because they're fundamentally anonymous, you get the business. And so open-air markets for drugs are a recipe for large-scale violence, whereas dealers are not. And what the UPP did is they smashed the open-air markets. Did it do anything to drug consumption in Brazil? No. Did absolutely nothing, because they converted relatively quickly to dealers. But drug consumption is a second-order problem relative to large-scale homicide. And so what it did is it deterred the homicide, it reduced the homicide by switching the mode in which drugs were sold. Second point, community policing. Starting in the 1980s, there was this vision of something called community policing in the United States, which ended up taking two different modes in New York and Boston. This is Ray Kelly in New York. You can see he's a tough guy, he's a real New Yorker. Community policing meant getting tough on quality of life crimes, locking people up for using squeegees, using stop and frisk. It was sort of a very heavy-handed approach, maybe necessary given New York's large scale, but deeply unattractive, and related to the enormous downside of locking up millions of American young men. By contrast, you can see this is Ed Davis in Boston. Ed's like a big teddy bear, okay? And community policing in Boston meant making friends with the community, getting the community to actually tell you who the criminals are. And it's harder, but it's a much more attractive way to deal with crime. And in the case of Ed Davis, a lot of it involved getting young women of color who are on the police force to be the first line of interaction with policing. And when you see things like this in the US, where you have this huge battle between the community and the policing, I will say that's a sign that the policing has gone totally wrong, because if the policing can't get the community to work for them, right, they failed. And the tragedy, so this comes from some work by my colleague Roland Fryer, is you have these things going on. The police are not doing a very good job to begin with, right? Then you have this sort of massive protest, and what happens? The police just shut down. They just actually stop doing anything. And as terrible as it is when the police are abusive, the alternative of no police is pretty horrible as well, right? And both of these things are awful. And really, there's only a model of this that is the policing actually connecting with the community and learning from the community. I really don't have time for this, but when rule of law fails in cities, it's often the most vulnerable who fail most. And some of my work on gender and trust in Zambia shows that, in fact, it is women who suffer particularly in these sort of weak rule of law environments. This is showing the markets in Zambia, so you can tell these are places of sort of urban creativity, but also relatively low incomes. What happens is in these weak rule of law environments that women go into a few number of industries. They're very low paid industries because they can work with other women. And when you ask them why don't they go into leather and allied product material, it's to say they can't trust the guys, that they deal with men and the men are abusive in a variety of different ways. We talked about the Alfred Marshall quote earlier about learning from each other in cities. One shocking detail from the Zambia data is that male entrepreneurs learn from other male entrepreneurs. Female entrepreneurs have to go to courses because, again, they can't trust working with the men. And so they're cut off from the urban ability to learn from other people. Now, when you have markets where you have a rule of law institution, so this is something that's called a market chief, this is the trust gap outside of markets. This is how much less women cooperate than men do. But if you put women in markets, they start trusting the same amount. And particularly, they trust even more if they're in a market that is dominated by women. Okay? So in fact, you can close this difference, but you need rule of law institutions that actually the women can trust if they're going to get beyond this. And we actually randomly provided access to good rule of law institutions that had a very large impact for women and not for men. Okay, I'm going to end here, and I just want to end where I began, which is there are lots of difficult things in cities. Rule of law is one way in which cities get out of control. Bad urban schooling, ghettos that form that isolate people, low quality of life in different ways. But let's not lose our sight on the big picture. For thousands of years, cities have been enabling us to work together. They enabled the people of the Netherlands to work together and create the first functional modern republic in Europe. That model, which is the model for my own republic 400 years ago. Right? Those miracles happen in cities. And when I look around myself, whether or not it's in the urban Netherlands or urban America, or even more so in urban Africa, I say to you that the age of urban miracles is not done. Right? It is very much around us. But cities need public policies that can enable growth, that can protect people from abuse, that can enable infrastructure to be moved smoothly, and can create a city that is a city that empowers outsiders as well as protects insiders. And that is the job for the 21st century. Let me stop there. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Edward. Great. Well, I will invite you back on stage later on. Or is there somebody who has a very urgent question or remark for Edward for this, at this very moment in time. Because I think you gave us a lot, not only to think about, but also to discuss further. For example, how to balance the private and the public sector, because you say we do need rules, things are overcome. But then, yes, how do we keep up from the public and the private sector? Well, there's a lot. At least I'm going to ask you later on, but for sure I can imagine that you will join me with that. Maybe then the best is then to step immediately and to give the floor to the alderman of the city of Tilburg, Berend de Vries. And now we are very curious, of course, what your answers are to all the knowledge given to us by Edward. Please step forward because the floor is yours. What is Tilburg doing? He says education is key. Education defines quite a bit what you are at the very end. Well, then you are well done with the knowledge institutes here in Tilburg. So, but give us some insights. What is on your agenda? How do you provide rules? Because that's apparently a key factor to success. The floor is yours, Berend.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Berend de Vries, and in daily life I work as alderman, vice mayor, or in Dutch, wethouder at the city of Tilburg, and responsible for the economic, spatial planning, urban development of our city. But more specifically, I'm responsible for the redevelopment of the Piershaven district, the Veemarktkwartier, Spoorzone, the kennis-as areas of the city, but more about that later. It's a great honor to have been invited to speak here today after the inspiring contribution of you, Professor Glazer. And to the Vrienden of Kopenhagen, I say thank you for the invitation. Before I became a vice mayor, I worked at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Does this work? No. We have to go back a bit. Someone. Right. This is a bit part of the surprise. All right. Yes. Okay. These are my friends. The mayor is in the middle. I promised to show this picture to you. Okay. Before becoming a vice mayor, I worked at the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and prior to that, I worked at the law faculty of this great university, and I am too an alumnus of Tilburg University. Although my academic career was fairly short-lived, I've been now a vice mayor for almost 10 years. And partly based on that experience, I would like to talk to you today about successful cities, and in particular the city of Tilburg. But first, and you saw it already start with some facts and figures regarding the history and the future of our city. The history of Tilburg goes back a fairly long way. The name of Tilburg appeared in the Liber Aureus in 1191, when a document dating from the year 709 was copied, which reported to have been written in Tilburg, also known as Tillyburgers in that time. But despite 1311 years of history, Tilburg as a city is still a relatively recent phenomenon. To be more exact, Tilburg acquired its city rights 211 years ago. And still, some people are not convinced of Tilburg's beauty as a city. In Brabant, we have cities like Den Bosch and Breda, which have well-preserved historic city centers and whose influence dates back for many centuries. And then we have cities like Tilburg and Eindhoven, both cities with a similar history. It was not until around the year 1600 that Tilburg started to grow in a serious way. And that thanks to local sheep farming. Tilburg became a prominent center of commerce in wool, but the oldest known map of Tilburg, dating from the 70s, it still shows that it's agriculture that was the base of our community. The growth of our city really started to take off in the late 19th century due to the mechanization of the textile industry. But around 1871, more than 75% of the Dutch wool industry was centered around our town. Employment in the sector reached its peak in the 1950s when there were 12,600 and, to be exact, 25 workers. I don't know, but it's really in the industry. But then a fairly steep decline in the 1960s. The textile industry went into decline as production moved to countries where wages were lower. This loss was gradually offset by other manufacturing activities and logistics. Today, Tilburg's economy is characterized by its strong manufacturing and logistics sectors. The economic growth drove the continued expansion of our city. It goes back to the agricultural times, but then in a few years, you see a city starting to grow. And now we're almost to the city today. Our city will continue to grow in the years to come, just like other cities in Brabant. Our city will probably continue to grow, to attract new residents, and the current projections are that we will reach 250,000 inhabitants in a few years. This is the growth prediction of all the municipalities in Brabant, and the big four cities have a logo. This is the growth projected for our city in the years to come, and will reach 250,000 people. But let's get back to the characteristics of Tilburg. Tilburg is also a student city, a city with a university and 2 universities of applied sciences. And the first decision on this was taken over 100 years ago. In 1912, the Catholic Academy was first set up in Amsterdam by Hendrik Moller. This institution then went to Den Bosch in 1913, but they made a mistake. The city council at this time were not supportive of Moller's ambition to establish a school of commerce as part of the academy. The city of Tilburg was more open to the idea and made land available, but was also willing to contribute financially. And Tilburg School of Commerce is the precursor of this wonderful university. The academy later merged into what is now known Fontys University of Applied Sciences. The arrival of the academy was an important moment in our history, and it sets the future course of our city as a city for students, a city of creativity. That's one reason why today there are around 45,000 students living in our city, 15,000 in secondary education and 30,000 in higher education, for instance, this university. The proportion of students in the city, I think, says something about the direction in which Tilburg is moving. Cities with more graduates are more likely to be home to more innovation and more new businesses. But when I read the work of Professor Glaser, it seemed difficult to see the link between the cities that are the focus of his work and the country we work and live in, the Netherlands. The largest city in our country, Amsterdam, just has around, and even less, 900,000 inhabitants. That pales in comparison with mega cities like Tokyo, Shanghai, or New York. So how come the Netherlands, even though it has no enormous cities, is still able to create so much added value? The Netherlands is 17th in terms of GDP per capita. And the Netherlands also outperforms expectations when it comes to innovation. In recent years, we have been consistently been near the top of the list of most innovative countries. You can see here. So one line of reasoning is that despite of its small size, Dutch cities are so successful because if you zoom out a bit further, you can actually view them as one large city with multiple centers or hubs. If you take a better look at this picture, the area of Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands are actually one zone, one big urban area with an amount of 30 billion inhabitants. The Tri-City Initiative, undertaken by, among others, VNO-NCW, the largest employers organization in the Netherlands, is actually based on the idea that the entire Rhine-Meuse-Schelde Delta is one large city. They've looked at this in an interesting way. But you can also view it from this perspective. If you look at the number of inhabitants per square kilometer, you see that the metro area of New York has around 724 people per square kilometer. In San Francisco, 411, Los Angeles, 210. And guess what? The Netherlands has 407 people per square kilometer. So we're sort of in the middle. But our urban centers, and that's maybe a challenge, are much less crowded. In Manhattan, there are over 27,000 people per square kilometer. In a city like Amsterdam, there are just around 5,000 people per square kilometer. And Tilburg, let's talk about Tilburg, only 1,870 per square kilometer. Based on your work, the work of Professor Glaser, that would seem to be a weakness. After all, proximity is an important factor in the success of cities. But at the same time, I think the Netherlands is able to cope with the disadvantages because of the extreme proximity of all the other cities. For instance, if you look at New York, not all encounters happen at one place. It only takes, for instance, 12 minutes by train from here to Breda. It only takes 22 minutes from here to Eindhoven and 40 minutes to Rotterdam Central Station. The same time it would take to travel from the World Trade Center to the Bronx Stadium in Brooklyn. The Bronx, sorry. In 2017, Pieter Tordoir published an update of his earlier study on commuting between cities in Brabant. And you see a map that shows the movements between the cities of Brabant. We see similar pictures for shopping, entertainment, healthcare, and education. There seems to be evidence of borrowed size. The presence of several cities close together which reinforce one another because residents can make use of services that other cities have to offer. Together, the cities of Brabant form one large city network of around 1 million inhabitants. Okay, but what does this mean at a local level for Tilburg? I think it means that we must keep the investments up for excellent connections between our cities to mitigate the disadvantages of our more diffuse urban area. There's also a need for collaboration, especially between knowledge institutions and businesses. But how do we do that? What is special about this part of Europe? How does cooperation occur? In many Dutch regions, we have triple helix cooperation, meaning that innovation agendas of respectively the business community, knowledge institutions, and the public sector are harmonized, creating plenty of scope for innovation. There is knowledge transfer between knowledge institution and the business community. The role of government is to encourage and facilitate the formation of these networks. But then again, triple helix collaboration can only succeed if the various partners are sufficiently on an equal footing. The model only seems to work well in countries like us. If you look at the US, there's a more market-oriented model, and for instance, China, the government is more in charge. Okay, but let's turn back to our region, back to Tilburg. Along with cities such as Eindhoven, Tilburg is one of the new towns that sprang up due to the Industrial Revolution. Tilburg was initially based on the textile industry, and Eindhoven was dominated by Philips, once famous for its light bulbs. And both cities have also reinvented themselves, just like cities like London, Chicago, and Milan. Tilburg has overcome the decline of the textile industry in the 1960s, and Eindhoven too, after a major loss of production from Philips, has focused on developing its high-tech sector. And both cities are home to strong universities, which were formed and have expanded in parallel with their development. And I think to a large extent, these universities feed the innovation that is required. In Tilburg, many other manufacturing industries have taken the place of the textile industry, and the logistics sector also boomed. In addition, a number of large insurance companies are based in their city, CZ, Interpolis, etc. And yet, Tilburg is, or still is, or was, or still is, on a high-risk trajectory, which is related to a low-skilled labor force, first in the textile industry, and later the manufacturing industry and logistics. Fortunately, we are in a transition from a less skilled manufacturing city to a more skilled IT producing city. And given the robust knowledge infrastructure and the associated large number of students, 13 to 50% of our population is a student, there are plenty of opportunities, and there are lots of small sized companies. The city's knowledge base is in areas such as business, social sciences, digital technology, data science, artificial intelligence, and these are precisely areas in which successful startups have become fast growers in recent decades. And most of the companies that we know today were set up by students, mostly students from this university. But we still have a way to go. A long way, perhaps. In the years to come, we will need to provide space for these new businesses, specifically in the sectors I've just mentioned, because we have a great deal of in-house knowledge, enough physical space for startups and programs that are generated through a close partnership with Brabant's knowledge institutes. That also requires more intense cooperation between the knowledge institutes in Brabant's economic ecosystem. Ladies and gentlemen, I frequently ask myself, how can I contribute to this? What is my role in local government? Because what makes our city attractive? How do we make sure that young people want to live, work, and stay in the city? The strategy of our city is to aim to provide a living and working environment that appeals to the kinds of people we would like to bring to our city, while avoiding the pitfalls of excessive gentrification. There are two examples that I would like to highlight: the projects in the Piershaven and the up-and-coming Spoorzone area. I remember moving into a new home in the 1990s. I was still a student those days, and I was lodging with a nice lady, a nice old lady. And I stayed in her loft in the Piershaven. At that time, the Piershaven was an area what was a really neglected part of our city. For those who do not know it, it is located at the endpoint of the Wilhelmina Canal, and by the 1990s, most industry had left. And it wasn't an area one would particularly want to go to. Today is a complete different story. The Piershaven has undergone a complete transformation over the last 10 years. From a neglected backwater to a very lively part of the city. Developers saw its potential, but they were not the only ones to play a role. Residents and private individuals also helped to forge a new role for the Piershaven today and the future. Another good example is the Spoorzone area next to the railway line. It's an area of 75 hectares right in the heart of the city and close to the main railway station. It used to be occupied by railway sidings where the trains were shunted and maintained. And now, today, it's a bustling area full of places to live and work. There are also places for meeting and culture, such as our museums. And, of course, you visited it yesterday, our renowned Lokhal. our city library, which was recently proclaimed World Building of the Year. The residents of Tilburg are embracing this location and refer to it as the city's living room. If you haven't been there yet, go. So you can experience for yourself what the power of social reuse can mean for buildings. The other strategy of the city of Tilburg is to prioritize the transfer of knowledge from our knowledge institutions such as Tilburg University and Fontes and Avans. I mentioned the triple helix agenda. And this is very much our priority in Tilburg today. Our agenda, drawn up with knowledge institutions and businesses, focuses on digitization, data science, AI. These are important challenges, alongside the challenges of climate change and the increase in digitization, that will have a major impact on our society and the way we do business. New business models are emerging, and as far as I'm concerned, Tilburg needs to be at the forefront of these changes. A good example of the agenda is the partnership between Tilburg University, Fontes and ROC, and companies such as the Persgroep, Zwijze and Interpolis in the MindLabs project. MindLabs is about AI. And of course, the partnership between Tilburg University and Eindhoven University of Technology in JATS, which is about data science. And given the scale and proximity of our cities, close collaboration between companies and knowledge institutions from neighboring cities is a must. And it therefore makes me very happy that both universities and Fontes have announced that they're fully committed to cooperate on an agenda on AI, with the support of a large number of companies and cities. I would like to emphasize that Tilburg University is already involved in AI and has around 50 staff working on it. Okay, but let's go back to Tilburg. We are planning even more. There's a good reason why a lot of people are talking about our city now. In terms of spatial planning, both the spoorzone, the kennisas or knowledge axis that extends from Tilburg University to the city center will feature that kind of activity. In addition, we will ensure that there's a constant mix of functions, businesses, knowledge institutions, residential units and places to meet and to enjoy life. And that also means building upwards. West Point, behind me, was built in the 1990s. The tallest residential building in our city and once the highest in the Netherlands. But I have news. More high-rise buildings will be built in coming years. And these are some of the plans that are currently being worked on. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to draw my contribution to a close. I hope that I have given some insights into the strategy being pursued by the city of Tilburg. We are well aware that we are part of a whole, and larger of a whole, an important hub in a small country. At the same time, in my role as a servant of the city, I see a transformation taking place in Tilburg. The ambition and capacity to play an important role in today's society is something to work for. And thankfully, I notice an increasing sense of pride in our city. I'm enjoying being a part of this transformation every day. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Berend. Please, Edward, may I invite you back on stage? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for giving these insights. Please be seated. I only have water. I'm going to serve you a glass of water after having given your keynote. I was wondering, Edward, when Berend was showing us the picture of the density of the country, he said the Netherlands, it's not a dense country, it's more like an empty city. Now, what kind of discussion is this? Because I think it's often asked to you, what does this mean? Because we are used to other numbers than you with your examples from the US or the city in China 11 million people where they do block and close now airports because of a virus.
I think he's exactly right. I mean, I think this is certainly when I view either the Netherlands or the Netherlands combined with Belgium, it's one large metropolitan area in any reasonable view. It's one that looks different from California, but of course it looks different because it was built on pre-car technologies and then connected by rail as opposed to one large car-based culture. But that doesn't mean it can't be a perfectly functional, incredibly robust urban system. It's just one that's built in a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we have microphones, or you can just yell, wave, whatever, to interact, because I really would appreciate if you participate in this discussion. Is there somebody already who says, well, I take my time now because I have a question? Yes, you? Great. Now, I know that I have some of the colleagues from the Tilburg University who are going around, but first of all, I will run to you with the first question. Please present yourself and say to whom you would like to address the question.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Angela. I recently obtained my PhD from this university on sustainable cities. And my question is to Professor Glaser. Thank you for your presentation. I saw in your lecture you mentioned words like cities of innovation, cities as places as consumption. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are, if anything particular, on Sustainable Development Goal 11, for example, and whether that is just a wish list, or if that is something that cities can really aspire to, given how important development and economic development is, in contrast to environmental or social aspects.
So great question, thank you. And I cut my sustainability slide because it was already going on too long, but that doesn't suggest that it isn't incredibly important. I think the first order thing is that cities are often depicted as being the enemy of the environment, but of course the opposite is true. That when we look, and I've done work together with Matthew Kahn, currently of Johns Hopkins, an environmental economist, and we assess the carbon footprint of households living in different parts of the US. And the punchline is the places that look green are brown and the places that look brown are green. And urban density is a recipe towards higher levels of sustainability for two primary reasons, one of which is just smaller distances traveled. And in the US, this means not taking the bus most of the time. This actually just means shorter drives. So it's driving, 10 minutes instead of driving 50 minutes, but that adds up in terms of gallons pretty darn quickly. And secondly, it's about smaller living spaces, even holding income and family size constant. So it is certainly true that taller towers are more energy intensive than large, single-family detached dwellings. But typically, people occupy much smaller apartments when they live in those areas. And so they have to heat and cool those areas with much less energy. So urbanization is not an enemy of the environment. It's really a friend. And one way to sort of make these numbers more dramatic is if the great growing economies of India and China see their per capita carbon emissions levels rise to that seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by 130% because of that factor alone. If they stop at the level seen at wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by only 30%. So that's really a huge gulf, and it says that urban density has really something to contribute towards taming our carbon emissions. The second point is, from a US perspective, Europe looks pretty green to begin with. Certainly we've got a lot of work to go to catch up with you. And probably has relatively little direct impact in terms of your carbon emissions on the future carbon emissions of the world relative to what's happening in India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, which are places that are poor, have incredibly tough climates, and we hope that they will become richer, and consequently they will do the things that rich people do elsewhere, which is they buy air conditioning and they buy cars. And this will create vastly more pressure than anything that you do in Europe in terms of your direct carbon use, which means that the most important thing that can happen in the Netherlands for the future of climate change is what solutions you come up with that will be stolen by Africa, by China, by India, right? That in fact it is the ideas that are produced here that will be borrowed elsewhere that are what really matters. So whatever you do, don't add up, like what are the carbon emissions here, add up, will this actually be translated? And if it's translated, how much of an impact will it have? And I think that's the sort of central thing. So, I don't want in any sense to take away from the thing that carbon emissions are incredibly important and incredibly central, and not that you shouldn't be working on it, but you have to have a global perspective. Because if you're just adding up local stuff, you're missing the main point.
Yeah, and then we must make sure that it will not be stolen from us, But we do sell it at a good price if we do come up with the right technology, don't we?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Although I certainly, you know, an economist, I believe in property rights.
Exactly.
Absolutely. But from an environmental perspective, it's okay if it's stolen. So.
Yes, that is true. Which is so true. Which is so true. Now, Ed, Berend was saying that we, as policymakers, we try to provide. This is how you said it, literally, living and working environment to the people we want to attract. And then you defined it further down that you said we want to be in the forefront of the new technologies like digitalization, artificial intelligence, data science, and so forth. Is this feasible? Is this the way things do go? Can you say as a city, municipality government, this is the people I would like to attract?
Well, I think very much the job of city government is to attract and train smart people, and then more or less to get out of their way, right? I think that's the right sort of economic development mantra. Mm-hmm. I think it's not clear which are always the right people, but certainly education is a pretty good predictor of something that you want, unquestionably. A certain diversity of skills are valuable. I think with industrial policy, you've always got to be a little bit careful because it's often difficult to figure out what was. I mean, I'm 100% on the view that Tilburg wants to be at the industries that are cutting edge of the world. That's clearly right.
But everybody wants this. Other university as well.
Absolutely, and it's not totally clear what will be. So you need to be a little bit careful with industrial policy, but I think in general, this cooperation with universities is part of the training and attracting mission that I think is a sensible thing for local government.
Okay.
But you're right, you're competing with the world. That is absolutely right. But you have assets. You have great universities, you have smart people, you have a great quality of life. All of these things are ones which make you, I think, globally competitive.
Okay. I think that but maybe I'm wrong, but I think that you said to us that cities, in the very end, should be able to pay for themselves. Did you say something similar?
I said that people should pay for the social costs of their actions, but I think it follows from that mostly that cities should pay for their costs too.
Are you able to pay for yourself as a city?
Well, we are in a situation that we do not fund ourselves because that's organized on a national level. Mm-hmm. But for the expenses that we have, there's...
But I mean also tax-wise, because that was what you were saying as well. You should pay for usage, if it's land, if it's buildings, if it's roads, if it's whatever. Are you able to do so, or is the Dutch structure is it hampering this?
Well, there are quite a few problems with how we organize our government. It comes from the times that we drove horses and not cars. So the way we created our government dates back from those times, the 1850s, around that period. So and if you look at our government from a perspective of a city, we're not well organized because most cities have a relatively small part of what you may call the metro area of a city, which they are allowed to govern. And the rest is governed by other municipalities, province, and even our national government. So it's not a very efficient and focused way of governing. But we've tried and discussed redesigning government in the Netherlands for ages. So I'm not very optimistic about changing this.
Yeah, okay. Now,
can I just try?
Yes,
there's a great
please.
question. I want to actually say it. So the Netherlands, like many European countries, has a large national share relative to local share, and often local expenses are funded by transfers from the national government. It is appropriate that the national government pays for expenses which are by and large redistribution to take care of poor people, right? In fact, if you make local governments responsible for all the poor people that live there, typically the rich people just run away. So it's in order to avoid having to pay those expenses. So you really do have to have a national focus on that. For other expenses, typically economists think that a greater local share is actually advantageous. And that means instead of using national tax transfers, having, let's say, for example, higher property taxes to pay for local infrastructure improvements, and indeed, for many cases, having user fees fund them. And I think I'm glad that the Netherlands is thinking about that. It's certainly worthwhile to having analyzed such an option.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, there's this discussion going on right now, but I'm not very optimistic about the results.
No, okay. Now you were emphasizing on the fact that we should try at least to better align the public and the private sector, because if not, then we do cause problems at the very end, and then for sure quality of life will be at stake. Now, one of the answers I think you were giving to this challenge, Berend, was that you said we try to work as much as we can in the triple helix. So we try to align government with knowledge institutes, with the entrepreneurial part of our society, even maybe with society in itself, the citizens. Is that the answer, would you say, to this very important task that we better align the public and the private? Is it in the triple helix or the quadruple helix?
So let me tell you when I heard the triple helix, let me tell you what I thought was so useful about this. What it seemed to me was this was a government leader who was making the case that for thinking about growth, for thinking about not just current businesses, but new businesses, for not being focused as economic development czars so often are on, can I get this one factory to open? And so they mark themselves on one factory rather than creating an ecosystem that is part of that. And that was absolutely great. The thing that's not part of the Alderman's remit, which is critical to this, are other elements of quality of life, which are then critical to attracting employees and to attracting businesses. So there's lots of public policy that relates to attracting businesses that's not called economic development policy. Often, quality of life policy is economic development policy. Policing policy is economic development policy. Because in fact, if you don't have an area that is exciting to live in, you're not going to attract the type of people who are going to start businesses that you want to be started.
Okay, yeah. Yes. Oh, there is somebody. There's one of the representatives from the universities coming over. Please tell us who you are and what you would like to ask.
Good afternoon. My name is Geert Lamerichs. I'm an economics master graduate student of this university. Thank you both for your presentations. I was wondering, Mr. Glazer, in your presentation you talked about the importance of cities in that you can talk to other people and you can learn from other people, and then also education. And within the Netherlands and also in the US, there's an increasing segregation within school districts. And so I was wondering what the segregation in learning has for an effect on the prosperity of the city and the future in growth. And then making the connection to a more developing world. I was in Uganda in 2016 and 2017, and there you saw that a lot of people from the rural areas were moving to the more urban areas because they felt as if they could learn more. But if that segregation would still hold, because coming into a new city, you can't really get into the economic heart of it very easily. So what does the segregation there mean for economic development?
Okay, segregation school-wise and with newcomers. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I showed you the graph, so I consider that comment to be entirely, right on. I showed you the graph which showed lower levels of opportunity in more segregated cities in the US, right? And it is absolutely true that more segregated cities have typically failed, particularly African-American children. I would say more generally, America's system of schooling, where where you live determines where you go to school, and if you want a better school, you move to the suburbs, has been an absolute curse on providing opportunity in urban areas. Typically, European cities and cities in the Netherlands have not fallen into the same curse. Your schooling, particularly for poor kids, is much better, which is why upward mobility is much higher here than it is in the US. But obviously, you always want to watch for that. You always want to make sure that your cities are providing schools not just for the smartest, but also for those people who start with less. And certainly, the rising immigrant populations create more challenges, but at least from my perspective, I understand I'm supposed to give you solutions, but I think we have a lot more to learn from you than the reverse. I mean, in fact, you seem to be doing an incredibly good job with immigrant populations relative to, let's say, the United States. So it ill behooves me to give out lessons on this, but it's a really important thing. Now, Uganda, the movement of urban to rural, rural to urban migrants is, of course, one of the great phenomena of the 21st century, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. What we do know from Afrobarometer is that kids who spend more time in cities end up being more literate and end up being more educated. So despite the failings of city school districts or city schools in sub-Saharan Africa, they are a lot better than rural schools. The issue of distractions is still there. So one graduate student I advise works on street children in Delhi. And in some cases, those children actually get less education than they did in the rural areas because there's more money to be earned begging on the streets in Delhi than there was in the rural area that they left behind. Despite the fact that actually Delhi schools are better than other areas. But this issue of making sure that cities are not just places of current productivity, but of long-run opportunity is absolutely central. And segregation is part of the answer, but it's also about making sure that the lower end of education everywhere, no matter what neighborhood you're living in, is lifted in the urban area, particularly for the most vulnerable citizens, particularly for immigrants.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah? Okay, you wave at me if you have a question. I was wondering, you said more than once in your keynote that cities do need rules. We do need a set of rules, how to get along with each other. How difficult is it to set rules, also when it comes to urban growth?
Well, we're living in a very regulated country where our province sort of dictates what we can build based on demographic models.
This sounds so sad.
Yes, but then again, it's not bad, completely bad, because in the end, it just follows what the market of consumers or people who want to live somewhere does. One of the problems is that the model is not right at the moment that we have to use it, because there's a time difference between when things occur and lots of migrants go to our province, for instance, and then a few years later, the province reacts, and then we have to build. We have to build houses now. So that's slightly a problem. But then again, we don't want to have the problems that Spain had in the recession. They build houses and build houses and build houses, and then the whole market imploded. So there needs to be some set of rules. But we over-regulated it a bit.
Because it's quite difficult to set exactly the right set of rules and not to hamper the growth, because that is the risk you do take constantly. But so what could you say
You're
to
absolutely
this?
right. So it's let me be more precise. You don't just need rules, you actually need the right rules, okay? You actually just, the goal is not to put random rules down and expect that they do well. Obviously, I've made it clear that in many cases, I think there are too many rules on building new housing, right? And it is not, in any sense, I want to be clear about this, I'm not an advocate that anyone should live in a tall building. I'm an advocate that there shouldn't be as many rules to prevent people from building tall buildings when it's appropriate. When there's a way to demand it. In the case of most forms of entrepreneurship, right, I think almost assuredly most of the markets that I've looked at have far too many rules that prevent entrepreneurship. And what is particularly appalling, and I believe this is true in Europe, but it's very clearly true in the US, that we regulate the entrepreneurship of poor people so much more strictly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of rich people. If you are a smart, well-educated MIT or Harvard or University of Tilburg student, you can start your internet phenomenon in your room, and there will be no regulators looking over your eyes. And in some sense, the internet, cyberspace, has created this vast regulation-free zone that has empowered innovation and entrepreneurship over the last 30 years. By contrast, because they're not coders, right, kids who grow up in poverty, a few miles away, they have to be entrepreneurs in the real world, right? And in the real world, there are a lot of rules. And so if you're 5 miles away from Harvard and you want to start your grocery store that sells milk products, you need 15 permits to go through to get through in doing that. And that is somewhat outrageous. And that's sort of, getting that balance of right. The area is where I think it's clear that you want rules are the really simple areas. And I'll give you a clear example, which is, and you can ask whether you think this is related to firecrackers on New Year's Eve in the Netherlands itself.
We told him about this,
But for example, one of the issues, sort of you wander through the Dharavi slum of Mumbai, which is one of the most entrepreneurial places on the planet, right? And it's entrepreneurial in part because no one's imposing any rules on anything. And it's full of people doing amazingly creative things. And you walk out after seeing one of these entrepreneurs and you see a child defecating in an unpaved road, right? And this is a real issue in urban India, is open street defecation. Often it's not that there aren't, latrines that are available, it's not that there aren't stalls, but the children are just choosing to defecate on the street. Now, there are a number of interesting economics papers about changing culture, but I don't really know how to change culture. I know how to impose rules. And so I think actually a reasonable model is when a child, or anybody defecates on a road, that there's some penalty. Now, because I try to be reasonably humane, even though my kids would tell you otherwise, my proposed solution is that when a kid defecates in an unpaved road, they have to spend 2 hours doing math homework in a community center, right? So that's which again, if you were my kids, you would argue that's cruel and inhumane punishment, but I think probably the downside is relatively limited. But you need something that is about limiting the sense that we can cause harm to our neighbors, and you need some set of rules about that.
Yeah.
And you can make up yourself about the firecrackers.
Yeah, maybe we
yeah.
It's free, yeah.
No.
Okay, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Florian Snickers. I'm an assistant professor of economics here at this university. Thank you for your talks. I have a question to Professor Glaser. You spoke about the centripetal and the centrifugal forces for cities. The complexity is likely to remain. Do you have any predictions for possible centrifugal technological developments, like how is the self-driving car going to impact, or is public transport more likely to improve much more in cities, such that cities are going to be even more attractive? What do you think of these balances of forces for the future?
So self-driving cars I alluded to, I think of them as having two paths depending upon whether or not we regulate them properly. If they are regulated inefficiently, meaning if we just let people sit and drive in them, I think they will make cities worse. I think because by lowering the cost of sitting in traffic, because you can now work while you're sitting in traffic, more people will sit in traffic and urban traffic jams will get more problematic. Consequently, they will probably be centrifugal technologies if that occurs, meaning that what you'll see is more people will actually, self-driving cars will still be able to function on low-density highways, and so people will be driving long distances, but not in cities because they're just crowded out of existence. If conversely, they are handled in a functional regulatory regime that installs a GPS-based road tolling system at all points that actually makes sure that actually they can move effortlessly around the city, enabling road sharing in a smart way, then they could certainly be a very effective centripetal technology instead and provide urban mobility in a quite effective manner. But the choice is up to the governments. Right? There are two paths which can be followed. In terms of public transportation more generally, I tend to think, at least in the US context, the big open question is buses. That in fact it's unlikely that given US density levels that rails are the future, and there's not a lot that you can do with a rail that you can't use with a bus on a dedicated lane. After all, bus rapid transit has been one of the great transportation innovations in the developing world that has provided mass transit at a lower cost for ordinary residents of Brazil and elsewhere. And the question is whether or not we're going to see a revolution in autonomous buses, autonomous electric buses on dedicated lanes that have constant Wi-Fi and are fun and exciting. That could work, and that could be something that could provide even more mobility throughout this amazing urban region than you currently have with rail. That sort of smaller town. So you have the rail comes in, and then you have autonomous buses connecting to smaller urban centers or areas within Tilburg that are not quite at the rail center, but connects off of it. So, but again, it depends upon the right regulation and visionary public leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have tests like this at the automotive campus. Yes, there's another question here. I have one over here in front. Yep, thank you.
Hey, my name is Robin Kuipers, and I have a question for our Elderman. So a few times during your presentation you mentioned the knowledge axis or kennisas, and now in many university cities in the Netherlands you have the universities sort of scattered throughout the city. You have a building there and a building there, whereas in Tilburg it's really focused on a campus at the edge of the city basically. And personally I really like the feeling that you're walking on a campus and that you're really walking on college grounds, but this idea of a knowledge axis kind of draws the university into the city center. So I was wondering, what's the purpose of this? What's the vision behind this idea?
Some more words on the knowledge axis. Yeah.
in the discussions with the board of university, we concluded that this university is growing, expanding, and in the end you can build this beautiful landscape with beautiful buildings and add new buildings to it, or you have to expand. You cannot expand into the woods because it's a monument. Don't touch the woods. So the only way is to build in the direction of the city center. And the whole idea of the knowledge access and the study we did is that the beautiful environment you have here will be copied in the direction of the city center, but with one exception, that it will be more a mixed use area than it is here. And that has one advantage, is that we know that these areas are more, well, the chance of more innovation and mixed use is probably going to help that. That's why we want to have the mixed use environment in the spoorzone, for instance. So in the end, with the beautiful Spoor Park in the middle, I think about this area as one big campus, not now, but in 10, 20 years to come. And then you can wander on, you can walk on college grounds from here to the city center.
Yeah. I was wondering, is this an answer to your question? Yeah? Okay. I was wondering, because at the end, you were showing us, in fact, a bit of the new skyline, or what Tilburg will become, because apparently decisions have been made that new constructions will be high-rise. Now you are in this function for 10 years. Mm-hmm. Could you have imagined 10 years ago when you started as an alderman that now Tilburg would construct and build high-rise buildings?
Well, we have already the West Point building.
Oh, yeah, you have some, sure.
But no, we were building the so-called Doorzon woningen.
Yeah. Do you know what the Doorzon woning is?
A typical.
No, I don't have a
typical Dutch building, and the thing is just a house with a small front yard and a smaller, also a small backyard. But the living room has one window at the street and one window at the backyard, and you can look through.
In one glimpse of the eye. Yeah.
Doorzon.
So, ever heard an explanation so well?
The translation we'll do at the drinks. But we've been a champion of Doorzon woningen. We have in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I show the map, built those houses well, in various forms. And the choice is, do we want to add more urban space to our city? If you know that there are less people living in a house, that means that you have even lesser people in a square mile or a kilometer. Services will be difficult to organize in those places. We already have in some places, in some neighborhoods, difficulties to ensure that there is enough shopping available, etc., etc. Yeah. So the choice is, do we keep on building Doorzon woningen and end up with a city that is not functioning well, or go up sky high? Yeah.
You do agree with this idea?
And there's beautiful landscape around our city, which is fun to be in. That's
You have once stated, too many people too close to nature is a real risk for nature.
Haven't you? That's true, too. I have said that in fact, one of the key, so I often tell the story about Henry David Thoreau, who's the secular saint of American environmentalism, but few people know that in his youth, he also burned down more than 200 hectares of forest land because he was having a picnic in the middle of the woods. And the point of this is that we're a destructive species, and often if you love nature, you should stay away from it. it, as indeed Thoreau could have done, which is something of an argument for urban consolidation. And it goes with this point of if you move people closer together, they emit less carbon than if you spread them out over space. But all of these other points are right too, right? Very low density dwellings with smaller households mean that you can't support local services, you can't support, and there's just a lot to like about the ability to build up. And this doesn't mean that everyone should live in a high-rise. I mean, again, we're not trying to socially manage things, but when demand is there for higher density dwellings, when demand is there for higher building, you're going to have to work hard to convince me that you shouldn't allow those buildings to be built.
Great. It is. You are the one who will ask the last question, because it's about time. Try to stick on that. Oh yeah, there is a colleague coming over. Maybe there are other people who really do insist in asking their last question or giving a remark, but first it's up to you.
Yeah, my question is about...
Who are you?
My name is Viviana. I live in Rotterdam, but I'm from Ecuador. But my question is about the public space and how it affects the economy in the urban areas, because for me, the encounters in the public space are very important as well. So for example, if you compare that, okay, people is together in LA, but they go in the car and then they're together in a small building in California, it's totally different to what happens in New York, where you have these encounters in the street. So how much should cities and should developers pay attention to the way in which they develop the public space in order to, create these human interactions that make cities so valuable?
Yeah.
It's a great question. It's a great and important question. And there are questions about sort of the parks that we love, and when is the right answer to have a large park like Central Park that creates sort of a real vast oasis, or small parks that are scattered throughout? When is it right to actually require buildings to create plazas in front that people then use as public space? This is one of the big decisions of New York City zoning law in 1960, was they used to have a system in which all the New York City buildings had to get narrower as they got taller, and this was because the primary fear of the 1916 zoning law was to create more light on the street. After 1960, they moved to an area in which you got height by creating plazas in front, which is why when you see the sort of modern buildings in New York, they often have these plazas. There's a great book by the great Holly White called The City, which actually details his work of sort of showing how much these plazas are used and what different spatial attributes lend the plazas to get more used and less used. We're just at a place in which we're actually getting a social science of this, meaning that we now can measure using cell phone usage of how people interact with each other, let alone the sort of larger question, which is how much does it change someone's worldview if they're constantly sealed up in a world in which it's car to office and going home versus if they actually are interacting with people on a subway or in a space. So social science is still a long way from being able to give a hard nose to this, and in fact we often have to go off of the intuition of planners and architects. But I will tell you personally, my sort of feelings of a city and sort of my observations suggest that these public spaces are incredibly important, and that you don't know a city unless you've walked it, and you don't get to see how a city works unless you see how people interact in these magical public interactions which are unplanned and are going on in those urban areas. So I think you're exactly right. I think it is actually important, but I also wanted to sort of say from the social science perspective, like this is a huge agenda for the future. It's sort of shocking that we don't actually have hard data that tells us the impact of these things beyond sort of the very narrow things like what is the impact of Central Park on local property values nearby. I can tell you that answer and it's positive, but I can't tell you sort of the more interesting questions that go beyond that.
Great. Well, some investigation to be done, on this subject. Yeah. Okay, now I'll look once more if there is a final question, a remark. If yes, then I think you will be the one, and then we go to the second reason of being together, and that means networking.
My name is Boudewijn Haverkort. I'm Dean of the Tilburg School of Humanities and Digital Sciences. I'm not an expert at all in this field. I have an open question. I read these days about things like urban agriculture and urban manufacturing, small-scale urban manufacturing. And I would like to hear whether Tilburg has a view on that, or whether there is a more global view from Professor Glaser on this.
Okay, who goes first? Berend.
We don't have a policy on that subject. We do support initiatives now and then, but there are some small scale with low impact on manufacturing and food production, for instance, but sometimes a high impact on social interaction. So that's why we sometimes support them. Okay. But that's the main focus we have on this issue.
Okay.
So I certainly don't have any problem if someone who wants to buy space on the free market and use it for agriculture or any form of manufacturing in cities. It's less clear that this serves some larger social good, and I'll take both of them in turn. Manufacturing was a natural urban phenomenon when the space used in manufacturing was modest. So when Henry Ford started his plant, he had about 20 square meters per worker. Now, manufacturing plants like that are typically at 200 meters per worker, right? So that level of space per worker is deeply non-urban, right? And that is the form, high levels of machines, robotics, that modern manufacturing looks like. So any sort of large-scale manufacturing for the global market is unlikely to be urban, and especially since the one-time advantage of cities, which is proximity to the transportation networks, that's largely eliminated. And we shouldn't be wishing to get that back. I mean, for 30 years we spent time wishing to get that back, and that was a foolish chimera. If there's a bunch of small-scale manufacturing of doing some soaps in the urban area and people think it's special because it's soap that's made in Tilburg, I don't have an opinion on that, but it's not going to be a source of No, it's nice. It's not a long-run economic thing one way or the other. It's sort of a small-scale niche product that may exist. I feel the same way about urban agriculture, which is if you want to have some local community gardens that educate kids, this is where your tomato comes from, this is whatever, that's great. I mean, I think it's wonderful for kids to see plants. I think a little bit of greenery is a great thing. But don't pretend as if urban agriculture is some solution to actually feeding either the city or the planet. And it's even kind of, large-scale agriculture is kind of terrible from an environmental perspective to put in the cities. And the reason is that the carbon involved in moving food is very modest. The carbon involved in moving people is huge. And so if you use land and you put the land in the middle of where the people live, you're pushing the people farther apart and you have to move them a lot more. And so the overall carbon impact of saving this trivial amount that you save by having the tomatoes right there as opposed to moved a couple hundred kilometers is overwhelmed by orders of magnitude from the fact that someone has to commute an extra couple of miles just every day in terms of this. So, it's fun, it's nice, but don't think it's sort of suddenly we're going to have wheat fields in the middle of Tilburg and that's going to look sensible.
Great. Well, thank you for this answer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have something to talk over during drinks. Is this an okay answer to your great open question? Yes. Well, then I'm going to thank you all once more for attending this fourth lecture of the Vrienden van Kopenhagen. It was great to have you all here. I hope you have gathered some new information, some new insights when it comes to urban growth, as well from the general perspective. And then we had the finest men, I would say, here with us in person of Edward Glaser. Thank you so very much. And also Berend de Vries. We all know everything now about the strategy from the city of Tilburg. Thank you so much. So I do kindly invite you, because I don't think there will be a final address from somebody from the university, no? Is it to me to invite you all for the drink? That's then what I will do. I kindly invite you and I ask you to give a last warm round of applause for these two gentlemen. Thank you so much. And thank you. Thank you so much, Berend. Dank je wel. Thank you.